Our next two speakers are already on the call. So it's Grant and Ari, who are the co-founders of a small company that's based in San Diego called Essential. And they are focused on legislative and regulatory software solutions. They've been implementing drafting systems around the world, most notably in California and the US House of Representatives and in Hong Kong. So I'll pass over to you two to take it away.
All right, thank you. I'm Grant Vergarotti. Ari and I are going to do separate presentations. I will start. There's Ari. Say hello, Ari. So we're going to do we're going to talk about two different things. So I'll start and then I'll hand over to Ari, and then we can have a discussion after that. Hang on. So I'm assuming everyone can see my screen, all right? All right, so I'm going to talk about a project we did.
Sorry to interrupt. I can't see your screen. It might just be me. But...
You cannot? Oh. How about now?
Yeah.
Did that stop me?
Now it's gone.
All right, let me see if I can do this a different way. The little button that says stop goes right over my slideshow, my show slideshow button.
I can see it now.
All right, is that better?
Perfect. Thanks a lot.
All right, great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a little project we did a couple of years ago, where we were tracking the climate change commitments that were established with the 2016 Paris Agreement. So we ended up converting laws from around the world into a single XML format. I'm Grant Vergarotti. I'm the CEO, CTO, and co-founder of Essential. A little bit about us, and we are exclusively focused on legislative drafting and the information produced by that, and regulatory drafting. That's all we do. We've been around since 2002, and focused exclusively just on the drafting problem, which we stumbled into by accident and discovered there was a very fascinating subject and one that doesn't get a lot of attention. So we've focused on it ever since. I'm here in San Diego. Actually, Ari's up in Palo Alto. Actually, I think he's in San Diego today. But we have employees around the world. Most of them in the US and Canada, but also we have people who work for us in Europe and in other places. Our customers include, the original customers, California, the US House of Representatives, various parts of the US House of Representatives, the Government Publishing Office, the Library of Congress, Nova Scotia. We have a big project underway right now with Oregon. We do work with Mauritius. In the past, we've done work with Hong Kong, the UK Parliament, Scottish Parliament, and the National Archives. So we have a wide range of customers all over the world. This particular project was led by the Secretariat of the Commonwealth of Nations in London, but it was also sponsored by various agencies within the United Nations. What the objective was to track the commitments made in the 2016 Paris Agreement on climate change and see how those were being turned into legislation. Our role was our role was just a part of that, and was to provide the technology to import, convert, and tag that legislation from around the world into a form that could be then used in a search engine. the project had a very small budget, very small budget relative to the types of projects we usually do. So we had to come up with a way to do this for very little amount of money. The plan was to take language from around the world in various forms, extract that into plain text, to get us into a normalized form, when necessary to convert that into English. And then the part that we did was to take that plain text in English and to convert it to semantic structured XML. After we had it into an XML form, we would then provide the technology to tag provisions using 4 taxonomies that were developed, outlined in the treaty. Those documents were then fed into a search engine. The process, because it was on a budget, we couldn't use very exotic technology. We relied on a lot of hard work from a lot of people. And we ended up having people around the world, England, Scotland, India, Italy, Kenya, Tanzania, working on actually doing the conversions and the tagging. We took a crowdsourced approach. We had direct employees of those various agencies that were sponsoring the project. We had students and professors at universities. Some law firms provided pro bono services, and their lawyers would get very involved. And then they also contracted with some people in India and Kenya to do the actual conversion and the tagging. We chose to use the Akomontozo format for representing the document. This is an XML representation, and it gave us a rich non-proprietary format that allowed us to have granular access to the information within the documents. I should say I am a member of the Akomontozo technical committee, so there was some bias there, of course. Akomontozo is an OASIS standard for representing legislation from around the world in a unified XML format. Its origins are at the United Nations and the University of Bologna. And we've been working for the last decade on the standardization of that schema. What Akomontozo gave us was a very rich, extensive semantic model based on worldwide experience from various different players in the field, all brought together into a single legislative document model. It also gave us a very rich metadata capability that we could use for the tagging and linking of the legislation that we were importing. The approach we took was what we called good enough converting. It didn't have to be perfect. The reason to do the conversion was to get it into a structured form and to get it into a search engine. It wasn't going to be used downstream. This wasn't going to be an official representation of this legislation. We just had to do enough to get it into a form that we could add the tagging. So that gave us some leeway into what we could do and how simple or complex the approach we would take. What we essentially did is we brought in plain text in English, and then we would read that. We would programmatically read that language in order to figure out what was what, where the chapters were, where the sections were, where the subsections were, what the basic structure of the document was, and then we would pass through that and build up the Akomontozo document from that. We did a basic analysis of legislative traditions around the world to decide which ones we would support, what the common ones were, because it's a huge problem if you were to take a look at all the legislative traditions in the world and try and come up with one single way of handling it. So we chose something that would be representative of most of the approaches we could find. We couldn't guarantee perfection, but that was fine. That wasn't the goal of the project. Here's a result of a document that was brought in from South Korea. And you'll see that it saw the structures, it saw the definitions, it saw the articles, chapters. We even preserved in some cases, this was converted to English, but you still see some of the South Korean text up above. We were able to carry that through, although sometimes that did actually cause us some problems, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. The goal was to, once we had it converted into this form, was to then apply a tagging taxonomy over the top of that. And the taxonomies were based on the Paris Agreement. So they took the language in the Paris Agreement and the various commitments that were in there, and they created 4 different tagging taxonomies. Because the treaty is a legally binding treaty, containing commitments to combat climate change. So countries were signing up to adhere to those commitments that they were making. And so what they wanted to do was to see how legislation was being passed that fulfilled those commitments. The taxonomy, there were 4 taxonomies they came up to. One was based on just overarching law. And then there were taxonomies for energy, agricultural, and urban planning. On the right, you see a bit of a hierarchy of one of those taxonomies. And what we would do is to go through the legislation, and then in this list, select the text, and then from this list, click on it and specify that this text was actually fulfilling that part of the climate agreement. Once all those documents were converted and tagged up, they then went into a search engine. That was actually done by a separate vendor in Romania. We weren't involved in that. Our responsibility was to feed the data to that vendor so that it could go into their search engine. Once you had the tag data in the search engine, you'd then be able to look up provisions in the various laws from around the world and search for legislation relating to specific commitments in that treaty. At first, we realized that there were a number of challenges to bringing in legislation from around the world, but it turned out there were lots of challenges we didn't even expect to come across. All the documents were converted to English, but they were coming in from other character sets in some cases, Cyrillic, South Korean, Japanese, Chinese. And the conversions were being done in a crowdsourced way themselves before it actually got to us. And the strangest things would appear. One that really stumped us for a while was we had a Bulgarian document, and it just couldn't see the hierarchy. It just would not see the hierarchy. Turns out what the problem was that the Roman numerals for 1, 2, 3 in Bulgarian look exactly like the same as the Roman numerals in 1, 2, and 3, but they have different character codes. And the person doing the conversion didn't think to change from one character set to another. So we just weren't seeing that text. Those are the sorts of problems we were stumbling across every day as we tried to deal with hand-translated text from character sets we weren't particularly familiar with or familiar with at all. The other one, I've already mentioned this, is that there isn't really a universal model for legislation. The Commonwealth style of legislation is very common around the world in a lot of the English-speaking countries, but it's not universal. And we had to be able to nonetheless understand and recognize legislation coming in from other legislative traditions. In particular, a lot of the legislation we were dealing with was European, which, while it's similar, it wasn't really similar enough for us to totally always understand it. So we spent a lot of time modifying the rules over and over and over again, until we could ingest all these different legislative traditions into one single model. Another thing we struggled with was the different formats that we were getting of data. Just because something is computer readable doesn't mean that we can necessarily computer process it. We struggled with a number of input formats. word processing formats are particularly annoying. There's a lot of generated text in a word processing file. So what you see on the screen isn't necessarily in the text. Numbering is often a case like that. The numbering is being generated. And so if you just look at the data, you can't see the numbering. And when you've got a converter that's reliant upon the numbering, and the numbering's not there, you're not going to see very much. So that required a lot of manual fixing. And there were the strangest cases that we would come across where half the text was numbered manually, automatically, and half the text was actually input by the user who drafted the document in the same list. And that would really throw our converter off. The other one that we struggled with, and this is something that we've always struggled with, are PDF files. PDF files are one of the most annoying things that we often deal with when it comes to conversion. Some of the PDF documents that we would get were not meant to be read by a human. They were actually meant to be sent into a printer. And what that meant was that the page order wasn't in read order, the page order was in a print order, so that multiple pages would be printed side by side and then folded and then cut. And so you would find page 1, page 11, page 3, it was an order in which the pages were being printed on a large sheet of paper for cutting. We had to then have someone go through and rearrange the text once we brought it into a reading order. Also, sometimes what we were getting was scanned documents, and sometimes very poorly scanned documents, where someone had obviously sat at a printer, at a copier, and copied it in, so the page was off at an angle, and as a result, the OCR was not always very good, and so we had to do a lot of cleanup to get accurate results, which meant a lot of time and energy was spent just converting text. In the end, the converter was able to work surprisingly well. Sometimes we were quite shocked at the conversions it was able to do, and pleasantly surprised, even though sometimes we were struggling. In the end, we were able to convert legislation from countries all over the world, where the original text was in all sorts of different languages. We also did do some experimental work converting French and Spanish. And much to my surprise, one of the contractors in India even took the converter one step further and was converting Portuguese from Brazil into the system. When he told me that, I kept saying, no, it doesn't work with Portuguese. And he said, it worked fine. I was like, no, I know it doesn't work. I wrote the code. It doesn't work fine. And he goes, yeah, it does. I made these changes. I was just totally blown away. So we brought in text in additional other languages other than English as well. So it was a small project. It had a shoestring budget, a tiny fraction of what we usually have. And I think a lot of it probably cost us as a company a lot more money than it did cost us a lot more money than we got paid for it. But it was a good learning experience. If we'd had a larger budget, we could have used much more sophisticated conversion technologies. We could have used contractors. We could have done a thorough document analysis. We have various approaches where we use contractors in China and elsewhere to convert text in bulk. But we didn't have the budget to do anything like that. So in the end, it was an interesting example to us of how we could apply one set of technologies to legislation from around the world, different legislative traditions, very different ways, and bring it into a single format. As I said, I'm one of the members of the Comantoso technical committee. So it was particularly interesting to me to see what issues would come up, what problems would arise that we would need to deal with. And in some cases that has been fed into the Comantoso to make it better for the upcoming release. So any questions before I hand over to Ari?
It might just be worth doing questions after Ari's spoken,
Okay.
if that's all right.
All right, Ari, do you want to take over?
Sure. Hi. Let me share my screen. Good morning, everyone from California. Let me just see.
Good afternoon.
Well, in California, it's good morning. So let me. Okay, are you seeing my screen yet?
Yes.
Okay, super. So I'm going to talk about technology and law and focus on how some of the technology that we're using, in fact, most of the technology we're using is not artificial intelligence. What we do, as Grant was able to show you, is we put a lot of real intelligence into the law. I work with Essential. I'm a lawyer, one of 3 or 4 lawyers who also do software. So there are not a lot of us in the world, people who understand the law, have practiced law, and also work on software. But that overlap allows us to both understand the details of the legal tradition and also try to modernize where we can. So, you know, a lot of pure software engineers come at the law and say, why don't you just use all of the same tools we use in software and forget about traditions? And a lot of lawyers come who don't have a software background just say, well, why isn't paper just good enough for our PDFs? So we try to combine the two. And one of the things I think that scares off a lot of lawyers in talking about technology in the law is that they think that there's something mysterious or that that the machines are taking over, right? And what I'm going to talk about is some much more basic engineering techniques that we're using to make things more accessible, to make things more understandable, and to, I think, in a lot of areas, what we're looking to do is make things more accurate by applying computer algorithms to some legal processes. I originally wrote this presentation with my colleague Sabrina, who's not here, so I'll try and carry her thoughts as well. And I'm going to keep it relatively short so that there can be a lot of questions, because I find that that's introducing new concepts about how computers can be used in a law provokes a lot of questions. So I'd look forward to that. The big idea of what we try to do with law in technology is to translate a very, very old technology, citations, into the online world. Citations, you know, lawyers came up with citations as a way of finding a document and sharing that document with any other lawyer in a very precise way. And that hundreds, maybe thousands of years later became the original became the hyperlink, right? So the original hyperlink is a citation. I have Title 4 of Chapter 20, Section 201B4 of the Civil Rights Act, or another law, and that pinpoints where in the law, elsewhere in this conceptual framework of law, I am referencing. And one of the concepts of a citation is that the citation, the place in the law, doesn't change, even if the text of the law changes. So we have amendments, and here I just write the beginning of one. That section, Section 201B4, is amended by, and you strike something, you insert something, and years and years and years of accumulated amendments, but the citation, the place, the conceptual place of the law hasn't changed. So how do we deal with that in an online world? We go to what Grant was talking about, which is called XML. And what you see here in the XML looks complicated. They are wrappings around the text to tell you where different pieces of the text are. And the part I'd like you to focus on is the reference to the law. Here is some regulations in Nova Scotia, and we refer to them with what you might have, you might be familiar with, a hyperlink. Here it's in AKN, which is the style of the reference. It's a Canadian Nova Scotia law, and it's a regulation from 2020, right? So we're just translating a citation into a hyperlink. And this sort of identifies what we're trying to create or translate, which is that most legislative documents right now are still designed for print, and we're trying to translate the basic network of communication between legal documents into an online world, so it's easier to go from one document to the other instead of looking it up on the book in your bookshelf, or even having to Google it. You just click the hyperlink from the reference. There are a number of different vocabularies for modeling the structure, for talking about what is a title, what is a chapter, what's a section. Grant was talking about acomodatoso. In the United States, we have United States legislative markup, which is what most of the federal legislation is used in. But essentially, they all try to do the same thing. They create a structure of the law. And by having a structure, I go like this because it's the title, the chapter, the section, the subsection. By having the structure, now you can point to that structure in the same way you can with a citation. The standards allow us to translate any laws into a known structure, so that if a law from the 1960s is translated in a law from today, we still know where in the law we're looking. And that this is the structure you see on the left. We indent it to make it easier to see what's a big level, what's a small level, and what's a very small level. And then what we can also do is model changes in the law as an insertion or a deletion. So you see behind the scenes what you have on the left. It's exactly that's just a representation of what you see on the right, which is the way it looks when we present it to the reader or the drafter. And these strikeouts are modeled in here by an insertion or a deletion. So I've gone through that one. What that allows us to do is to analyze the legislation using a number of tools. What we did for federal legislation, laws in the United States, is that we analyzed the amendatory language. So we're trying to translate the amendatory language into a computer readable language that's equivalent. And that way we can go back and forth. So bills are written in words, in natural language. So we want to translate that into a computer understandable language. And the way we did that in the United States is to analyze all of the phrases. There were more than 300,000 individual phrases that made amendments to previous laws. And of those, we broke them down into categories, and those categories came to under 5,000 unique amendatory phrases, like ways that you could say, I'm changing this law by striking this and inserting that. Or sometimes they do it the opposite. I'm inserting the following phrase and striking everything afterwards. So we could do this by patterns, and that would be just to match the exact phrase or match something like the phrase, but that would require at least 4,900, almost 5,000 different patterns. And then if you come up with a new pattern, pattern 1 and pattern 2, we wouldn't be able to handle it. So instead, we created a machine readable grammar for it. And the grammar understands things such as and, or, but, so these conjunctions, so you can combine different pieces of the grammar. What I'm showing you here is a screenshot from our application in the US House of Representatives, where we break up bills into their individual amendments, their amendatory phrases. We find the place in the database that represents the law that's going to be changed. That's the citation. And we make the change that the amendment says to make. Okay, so all of what I was talking about before builds up to the possibility of doing this. We find the phrase, and in this case, the phrase is Section 1011A of the Consumer Financial Protection Act of 2010 is amended by, is amended by striking Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection and inserting Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Right. So for any drafters or any lawyers on this call, you'll recognize this, right? They're changing the name of an agency, and they're doing it throughout the law and in different places. So the challenge for our software was to find first, where is the change being made? Here it's section 1011A of the Consumer Financial Protection Act, that's the citation. And we pulled that citation out in the application so you can see it in context. Where is the change being made? Second, what's being done? It's amended by, and the first thing that's happening is striking this phrase. So we find it, the phrase, and we strike it. If we don't find the phrase, we issue an error, and that's part of allowing the drafters to self-correct, right? If they write a phrase to strike and they make a typo, or this has already been amended, they would know it before the law gets passed, creating a confusion in the law. And then the second is the insertion, inserting Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Then in context, we've got 31 different amendments in this bill, and I'm hovering, I don't know if you see the hover, but at the top right, there are 31 different amendments in the bill, and you can navigate one after the other to see in context in the law how that's done, what the change would look like. And this allows our legislative process also to be more accessible and more efficient, because before our legislators vote on a bill, they can see what it would do to the law. And it's nice for a bill that makes 31 changes. It's essential for a bill that makes 1,000 changes, and otherwise basically you would just have no chance of reading the whole bill and understanding all the changes that would be made. I'm just briefly going to show you this next step, which is to compare two documents. So let's say you don't know the amendatory language, you just have two different documents, and let's say you don't know even what jurisdiction the documents come from. So the modeling that we do there is we still need the structure. We need to know at the top level what the document is, what the paragraphs are, what the numbers are. But then when you compare the documents, different pieces of the document may move somewhere else. And you may be familiar with this in Microsoft Word track changes. But at the same time, track changes does a pretty lousy job if a paragraph or a section has moved from the top to the bottom or somewhere else. And what we try to model is all of those moves. And what you're seeing here is an inline change where document A became document B, and a number of the paragraphs got rearranged and some text got changed. What we can do with these comparisons, right? So here you see a change, some text was deleted, some text was renamed, some text was inserted, right? So we identify all the kinds of changes from document A to document B. And then with our modeling language from before, what we can do is first we show these changes again in context. Here's document A compared with document B, and you see the changes. And provisions got inserted up here after the acts. A parenthetical was inserted at the end of the sentence, right? Each of these is a change that we could tell just by looking at the text, right? This is going the other way, not having the amendatory language, having just the two bills to begin with and comparing them. But then because we have the machine readable amendatory language, we can go from this back to a machine readable text and then back to English. So from here, these changes, we can create the amendatory language. So up here, insert and provisions before described, that was generated by the software. It read this, it saw that there's an insertion. It has a limited number of potential phrases for amendments, and it created the amendments for the drafter. And you can see on the left-hand side, under section 4, the computer readable language. The change types are insert, insert content, insert paragraph, right? It's close to English, but it's not. Redesignate is our word for changing the numbers. And then from this computer readable language, it goes back to English. And I'll just have one more slide and then open to questions, comments. We also can do this in a paginated form. So if the law has, or the bill has page numbers and there's an amendment to the bill, here there are no page numbers, so you get page 0, line 0, right? So the location is ambiguous. But when you do have page and line numbers, we can generate insert national before space at page 8, line 15. So we can go all the way back around to the amendment language generated from comparing the two bill versions. And that's that's the cycle that we talked about of amendments. We start with comparing two bills. We go to the machine readable amendatory language, and then we can go backwards from the machine readable amendatory language, apply that to a bill, and get the changes in the bill. So the new bill or the new law after the changes have been applied. So I know I'm throwing a lot at you. I wanted to give you the big overview of the kind of technology we apply to automate understanding changes, and then would love to hear any questions or thoughts that you have.
Thank you very much, Ari and Grant. That was two fascinating presentations. I'll start us off with questions. I've got one for you, Ari. Sorry to put you on the spot straight away, but I really enjoyed how easy it was to visualize the changes in legislation. And I was just wondering, is it possible to keep that visual representation of changes and make it public for a period of time, so that people who've been continuously using a bit of legislation in their work would really be able to easily see the changes to the law?
Absolutely. And the reason we did this project in the first place in the US House of Representatives is that a legislator came from a state in the United States where those changes in the law were that's the way the law is passed in their state, right? So you write the change into the law, you show it, and you say the old law is changed to look like this. So he made a rule that was adopted in the US House that you have to do that for important legislation before you vote on it. So our software is actually used to create that report of the changes and post it online. And then it just stays there. So in the process of making the decision on whether to vote for the law, anyone in the public can go to that change document and review it. So absolutely, the goal is to make it public. The next stage, what we have not yet done, is to make that dynamic view where a member of the public can look at any law and see how it's changed over time. We haven't made that available to the public. And part of that is an issue of training, because it's one thing to train, 40 committees to understand what it means and what stage of the process you're at. It's another to train millions of people in the public and not get too much feedback from them. I don't know how to hit this button. I don't know. So and unfortunately, our legislatures, as you might know, don't have the kind of help desks or the tech support that a Google or another large tech company might have.
Yeah, it's the same situation here, really. So Sergio has just popped the question in the chat. So he thanks both of you for a really interesting presentation. I was wondering about the process of converting laws to AKN in a bilingual drafting system, such as Canada or Wales. When there's small differences in the meanings between two languages, how do you address this issue, and how often do you come across it? And if not, what would your considerations be in doing so?
So let me talk about that. We actually came across that problem when we did Hong Kong. In the case of Hong Kong, we had to do side-by-side legislation where we had the Chinese on the one side and the English on the other side. And so we converted in both English and Chinese. Some of the difficulties we had were things that the English hierarchy differed from the Chinese hierarchy. Conceptually, although they aligned on the English side, we had the typical part, chapter, section, subsection, but those concepts didn't exist on the Chinese side. So there it was level, 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 and it was just the numbering level. And so we had to align the two, and by cross-linking them so that we could display them side by side. So when you would view them, you would, as you scrolled through, they would scroll. And now some of the difficulties that created were the Chinese version was way more compact than the English version. So what you could say in just a few characters in Chinese would take a lot more words to say in English. So we had to be able to have the screen adjust and adapt as we scroll down. So those were some of the challenges. Other challenges we faced were just not being able to read the Chinese side, so having to rely on contractors who would help us understand. There came a point where I could recognize a very little bit of Chinese. I knew what that meant. But putting two very different traditions together was quite a challenge.
Thank you very much. That's really fascinating. I'll open the floor now and see if anybody else has any questions for Grant or Ari. I've got one more, which is more vague. It's a question for you, Grant. I'm aware you come from like a technical background. I believe aerospace and then databases, and now obviously you're in the sort of legal informatics area. If there was one thing you could ask lawyers to stop doing, what would it be?
If there's one thing, and Ari referred to this, relying so much on paper-based traditions. One of the missions for Essential is to lead the transition into a digital world. But to do that, we have to take hundreds of years worth of legislation and advance it into a digital world, which means we have to we can't change that legislation. It's got to stay as it was. But many of the practices that we have to further move into the future still continue to rely on practices that come from a paper-based world. Page and line numbers in particular is one real anachronism, where the published form in a digital form doesn't guarantee certain page and line numbers. But so much of the legislative process, particularly on the amending side, relies on very precise placement of page and line numbers, that we end up having to spend sometimes an absurd amount of money in ensuring very precise layout that will be exactly as it was in the past. We've had, in one case, we had to ensure that our new system would produce text that was within 1/72nd, 1 point identical, so you could put the old legislation and the new legislation on top of each and not see any difference. And that was very difficult to achieve when you're using a very different technology to achieve the same result, that no one's really going to notice that level of precision, but that's what's required.
Thank you very much for that. That sounds painfully detailed. I'm sorry you had to go into that level of detail. That sounds pretty tricky. Okay, I'll give it a couple of moments to see if anybody else has a. Oh, Paul, you've got a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, question for Ari, really, about the application of the technology. I'm delighted to see that other jurisdictions also spend a huge amount of time making almost pointless verbal changes, like changing the Consumer Protection Bureau to the Bureau of Consumer Protection, which seems to achieve very little at all to me. But probably like other drafters, I have spent a huge amount of time in the past trawling through the statute book, finding all the hundreds of references to a particular body and writing out 100 or 200 amendments to them. And I wondered whether there's do you see that as a potential application of your technology for making our task an awful lot easier? Because if you could combine a sort of search engine that finds all your references to the body with your system for producing an amendment to them, then you could probably save drafters hundreds of hours. If we could kind of find all the references, click on them, and produce visually the result that we want very quickly, which could then be translated back into a textual amendment. I don't know whether other drafters would agree. That would make our lives a lot easier.
Yeah. So I guess the first question I'd ask is, are you available for working with us? Because that was specifically not a task that we were given in the project that we're working in the House of Representatives. So I'm a bit embarrassed to say, if an amendment comes through that says, which they often will, in all acts and in other legislation which has this phrase, change X to Y, that's one of the kinds of phrases that we give as an error, because we're not built right now to handle that. But it's a terrific use case. And I guess to me it points to how our technology is built. Even though I got my law degree, for most of the time I've been practicing as a technologist, and Grant also. So we rely a lot on speaking with drafters like you to know what it is that we should do, and we've got a lot of tools at our disposal. The task you described, the hard part of that is the consolidation, right? And there was a talk before about consolidation. If you have the laws all in one place and in a database, the search is super easy. And the change you talk about should be relatively easy. You say, change this word to that word everywhere it's found, and you create a list. But no one asked me to do that, at least. I don't know, Grant, if you've had that task, but would be a great use.
So we actually do have a project underway right now with Oregon, where they have the revised statutes, which are essentially the consolidated form of the statutes. And one of the projects coming up is to integrate a search engine with that, so that we can do searches, show those search results in the editor, and then you can create a pick list, like a shopping list of sections to change. We had done something similar in California way back. The thing was called Bodybuilder, and it would build the body of the document. Of course, at that time, Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor. But the Bodybuilder basically allows you to select. You search through the revised statutes, you find the provisions you want to amend, you click on them, and you say, build me the body of the bill. So that's a project we have upcoming for Oregon in the coming.
And I get particularly excited about features like that, or tasks like that, because technologically that is so much simpler than much of the technology we do. It's a search engine which has solved a technological problem, right? And that's one of the things our company tries to do, is to combine the knowledge of software engineers, technologists, and lawyers, because often lawyers think the hard things are easy, and they'll ask us. One task we've been trying to do for 2 years at the Law Revision Council is that in the layout of a bill, there's a period at the end of the paragraph that, because of the way browsers work, the period ends up on the next line. We still haven't solved that problem, and it's taken us 2 years. That's hard. The search engine you talk about, that's easy.
Yeah, so as Ari said, sometimes something that seems easy is actually quite hard. But actually, sometimes the opposite is also true. Something that you would think is hard is actually quite easy when you have the right technology. And that's the reason we focus on XML, because it allows us to put the information into a structured form where we can start using the information in the document. We can use that as information in the document to provide all these capabilities. We're not just trying to understand the text.
Okay, we've got one more question. I'm sorry, I can't see your name, CZ, but go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, so thank you for that fascinating presentation. So my question is, sometimes it is quite easy for me to compare where is the changes, right? I can simply upload two different documents online, and there are tons of websites and applications to tell me where's the change. But the thing that I find it important is that I want to know where the change is relevant to my business or my specific industry. So I was wondering if you have such features, or if you envision such features to be realized in a very.
So again, that's a feature we haven't been asked to build, but we've gotten asked something close to that, which is if a particular legislator wrote one paragraph that goes into a bill that's 200 pages long, and the bill got changed, they want to know if their paragraph is still there, right? So one way I could conceive of doing that is you still do the comparison as before, and then you apply search on top of that. We could do it by labeling, but part of that issue, it goes back to the question that Paul asked. When a new feature comes out, the next step we do is we would try to ask you and understand, what do you mean by my industry, right? So that we could categorize and to help build in those that information. Because one of the challenge that we have is if the information is not in the comparison, we can't give it to you. So first we'd have to understand, well, what is the industry? How do you want to find it? And then we would build that. So again, this would be a new feature that we haven't built. Grant.
We often get asked, particularly when it comes to regulations, if we can build some sort of mechanisms that can alert people to regulatory changes, particularly regulatory changes around the world that might affect the company. We've had banks come to us and tell us that the amount of money they lose by not being in compliance with regulations, not that they deliberately weren't in compliance, that they just didn't know about the regulatory changes around the world. That in itself is such a vast amount of money just at one company that you would think that that in itself would fund an activity to solve the problem. But we haven't yet tackled it on that sort of a scale.
James, you've got a question.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to pick up something that Grant said earlier about lawyers living in a kind of print-based world. And I think certainly in our case, it's not that we want to live in a print-based world particularly. I think it's that we're forced to sometimes by, well, in our case in Wales, the systems that the legislature has got in place force us to do that, and we have to produce all of our legislation as Word documents that then get turned into PDFs, and then at the very end of the process there's a sort of extra work done to convert all that into XML so that it gets published, which it seems to involve a lot of fairly unproductive effort really. And I think it'd be far better from our point of view if we had a system where we just worked in XML to start with, where things we were drafting could interact with the existing published legislation in the way that Ari's been talking about. But I think unfortunately we're kind of stuck with that at the moment. I think in the UK Parliament and Scottish Parliament, I certainly remember people they've developed a new set of software, and I think they were talking about doing some of the things you've been talking about, where they could pull down text from the published legislation and amend it, and then people will be able to see how bills affect legislation you know, as they, even before they've been passed. But I think unfortunately in Wales we're not yet in that position. But I think
I actually worked on the prototype for that system,
yeah,
with the National Archives and the UK Scottish Parliaments. In the US, we have an expression that it'll take an act of Congress to change that. In our case, that's literally the case many times. In order to make the changes that would really help expedite the process would require these legislative changes and procedures. And sometimes that's just really hard to get through. A lot of the legislative traditions that we often deal with are so old that nobody really knows how to change them. So even if everyone wants to change it, no one knows who can change it. We came across that a lot in California.
Well, and Grant, you also often tell the story of traditions that nobody knows why they're there. Everybody dislikes them, but no one's afraid to change them.
Yeah, so we came across that in California so much. It was like, well, why do you do it this way? Like, because that's the way we've always done it. Well, how do we change it? And no one really knew what the process might be to change that procedure. And so we couldn't ever get it changed because no one could. They didn't know if it would take a rule change, a legislative change, what change would make it be different than something they've done for 100 years.
That's really interesting. Did that answer your question, James?
Yeah, thanks. I think probably we need to try and work on showing the legislature the benefits of some of these things, because they often are asking for things like, can you produce us a text of what the amended legislation is going to look like when your bill has been passed, which doing manually is an incredibly tedious and fiddly
arduous job.
It takes a lot of time.
Right.
But maybe if we did our bills differently, that could perhaps be easier.
What Ari was referring to earlier with the legislator who came in from the States is the practices in the US state, around the states, tend to be quite different than the federal government. And so people come in from the state houses around the country expecting a fairly sophisticated track changes mechanism, which they then don't find at the federal level. And that's why we sometimes get some of the work we get is to try and bring some of those traditions that we've already learned about in the state work we've done, bring that to the federal government, which is exactly what's happened with the case of Ari's project.
Interesting. I think sometimes it's not necessarily a hesitation to change a tradition, but at the point of changing a tradition, you feel the need to be correct. And when you don't know what you don't know, it's quite difficult to have the confidence to go for a new solution. But I'll just bring Natalie in as she's got a question.
Hello there. Yeah, no, just going back to the wish for people to wish there was some technological tool which could analyze new legislation, new regulations, and work out what they need to know about. I mean, do you think it's actually realistic for technology ever to be able to achieve that? Because given that, you know, the number of things that can affect a particular business, you know, be it tax, environmental, employment, health and safety, all those things, you know, there's a real sort of fundamental difficulty in technology being able to replace the human mind, and looking at that and reading it and working out what its effect is. Does it have an effect on a particular industry? I mean, we always, in the Welsh Government, where we think about, well, could we, for example, tag up all our legislation which offers protection to residential tenants? You know, it's very difficult to get beyond the point that somebody has to go through all that legislation first, and usually a lawyer, and work out which bits of it are relevant to protecting residential tenants, and then somebody applying the tag to that legislation. And that, I don't know, perhaps I'm being very very pessimistic about the potential of artificial intelligence, but I find it very difficult to envisage technology being able to replace the good old human mind in that way?
From my standpoint, I don't know that we should be trying to replace the human mind. I think we should be trying to augment it, help people deal with that vast amount of data without necessarily taking their job away, but provide the tools that give them the visibility into a vast amount of data, so they can see where the areas they need to look at are, and that's the sort of tools that we can provide. Not doing the work for you, but helping you do your work, you do your job better.
So perhaps would it be a higher level identification of new legislation or new regulations that might potentially be relevant, and therefore you have to look at, but and then a person has to look at it to work out if it is actually relevant and what its effect is.
Yeah. Many of our projects, one of my earliest projects working with Essential, I thought we could replace what the classifiers were doing. So we identify the place in the law that this provision is going, and we just replace it. And what I learned is that's never the case for our tools. What we do is we provide a suggestion, and then the lawyer comes through and decides yes, no, yes, no. So for the tagging, it reduces the need to be so accurate. Go ahead and tag it up with your best efforts. We present that to the decision maker, but the decision maker can always say, no, this isn't a relevant tag. This one is actually more relevant. And having that 2 layers puts a lot less pressure on the technology to be exact or correct.
One of the things that one of the lawyers said to me very, very harshly was, remember, you are not a lawyer and your software is not a lawyer. It takes a lawyer to make that decision. You can present the information, but you can't make the decision.
Thanks very much. And thanks for your presentation. It's really very interesting indeed.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any more questions in the chat, or nobody's shooting their hand up. So I think I'll just leave it as a thank you very much for coming along and giving us such an interesting presentation. Certainly a lot to think about, and yeah, thank you for definitely comforting people that technology is not going to take away their jobs. That's always a good one to end on.
Yeah. Thank you so much.